wonderful. That is coming from indigenous people from the Andes mountain in Latin America. Also to keep in the room a bit of taste from Latin America, from India, from Italy, from all over the world. And I'm happy to share this responsibility, of course, in this session with Ritesh Singh. We have a wonderful connection. We met only this morning, but you will see our wonderful connection. Please introduce yourself and have some words of welcome, Ritesh.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. My name is Ritesh Kumar Singh. I work for the state government of Karnataka. I am the Principal Secretary, School Education, and it's a real honor and privilege to be here. A very warm welcome to all the participants, all the Pujya Swamijis, all the distinguished guests who have gathered here, and I hope that the inspiring session that just preceded this present session also would be equally inspiring for all of us. Thank you. Back to you, Ricardo.
Thank you. Our role in this moment is just to synthesize very quickly the messages coming from the three working group we are dealing with, or the content of the reflection of the three working group we are dealing with this morning in this session. And I will start with this reflection that if you read through the policy pack, you will see a constant reference to the role of communities. And the role of communities and of states, small communities and bigger communities formalized juridically in state, has been at the center of the reflection of the Special Committee of Financial Issues, but also of the reflection of the group that dealt with the SDG plus and civic spaces. The messages and the recommendation coming from those groups were basically on, I would say, the strengthening of democratic process and the needed tools for that sometimes are very technical tools and even financial tools. So at first I think that it's important to remember that there was a strong call on the worry coming from shrinking civic spaces and for the need to make civic spaces available for all. That means also for marginalized group, indigenous people, and groups that don't share the same opportunity to participate in the democratic process. This means also rules for the communities and for the state, and so there was a strong attention to all the issue of anti-corruption processes and rules, transparency and accountability, the managing of the action to contrast illicit financial flows, stolen assets, and organized crime. And beyond this, we have a reflection on the financial commitments of governments in funding the 2030 agenda, in providing available and sufficient fiscal spaces. This has to do with the debt issue, to redesign the debt architecture, to redesign and to provide a democratic global tax governance and tax systems, to identify precisely the role of private actors, but also the role not only in contributing to the agenda, but also to understand what is the negative contribution. And we are speaking about externalities, negative externalities. These are sometimes technical, very technical issues, But we have to keep all these things on the table to be able to shape a better future for all. Better future means to include the space of the planet and the role of the community in preserving our planet. And on that, I leave the floor to Ritesh to explain what are the recommendations of our third working group.
Thanks again, Ricardo. I will quickly go through the recommendations, the salient recommendations of the Sustainability and Resilient Communities Working Group. It is directly from the draft that has already been submitted, and I was told that was published yesterday. The detrimental impacts of climate change make it imperative that we act unitedly, equitably, inclusively, and justly to protect the people and planet Earth. The C20 Working Group on Sustainable and Resilient Communities proposes policy recommendations to mitigate these global challenges. The working group has outlined a set of transformative measures that will lead to sustainable and resilient communities through more nuanced and informed developmental pathways based on greater equity, justice, and inclusivity. The policy recommendations from the 4 sub-themes, namely climate resilience and social justice, environmental sustainability, net zero emission management, and compassion-driven approaches to sustainable and resilient communities, have been cumulatively reviewed and curated. The following overarching categories of recommendations have emerged. C20 urges G20 to ensure implementation pathways for efficiency that are compassion-driven and engage all sections of the population, creating targeted investment opportunities, as well as co-developing adaptation metrics and standards across sectors to guide investment decisions. Localized implementation approaches need to be in place considering the sustainability factors. The next recommendation reads, G20 needs to incentivize transparent and effective public-private and social sector partnerships for sharing expertise, knowledge, experiences, local context-specific best practices and resources to enhance innovations and sustain actions. The final recommendation is, G20 countries should support their education systems to develop and implement curriculum and training modules specific to climate change and resilience, net zero emission targets, biodiversity conservation and ecosystem restoration and degradation at primary, secondary, and tertiary level. Along with providing affordable, equitable, and quality education, community-specific capacity development programs need to be developed to create community-wise champions. That's all from that's the summary of the working group on sustainability and resilient communities. Back to you, Ricardo. I think we can introduce the guests and get started. Thank you.
Ritesh, one of the main messages coming from the groups and specifically from the Special Committee on Financial Issues is to strengthen the role of United Nations. We are working in the framework of G20, but we have spoken about participation. Let's think about what a citizen from Ghana, from Ecuador, where this shirt comes, from Chile or Gambia or Thailand or Vietnam could think about the G20. They are not invited to the table. They are not invited in a hall. We have to call G20 to work with its power to strengthen the room of everybody, that is United Nations. And we are very honored to have with us Mr. Shombi Sharp, who is the UN Resident Coordinator for India since November 2021. He served for more than 25 years in the United Nations framework. He was United Nations Resident Coordinator in Armenia before coming to to India. He held several leadership positions at the United Nations Development Program, the UNDP, in Georgia, Lebanon, Europe, the Commonwealth of Independent States, and the Russia Federation. He published several books on health economics, and he worked also in in the USAID, and policy champion and nominee for UNDP Administrators Award. We are very happy to have you with us, Mr. Shambi Sharp, and we leave to you the floor. Being honored to have the voice of United Nations among us, because as I was saying before, this is our common framework and home. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And it's wonderful on behalf of the United Nations system in India, as representative of the UN Secretary General, to be here for this truly important summit of Civil 20, to join all of you on stage, and most importantly, to join all of you here in the audience today. Mujhe aap sab se milkar bahut acha laga. It's so much energy for early on a Sunday, I think. Is it a Sunday? Lost track. But look, I think that truly now we're last night, yesterday, we're talking about kind of really big picture items, and we're still talking about big picture items, but now we're drilling down and getting to the serious nuts and bolts. We've spoken, of course, about the bad news, the poly crisis that we find ourselves in, the fact that because of this terrible confluence of crises, the ones that kind of are a bit expected, the ongoing truly existential crisis of the triple planetary crisis, climate change, biodiversity loss, pollution, then the unexpected ones, the emergence of war, the impact on food, the prices of all of those basic necessities of life, fuel and such, which are impacting the poorest people, the poorest countries, and the poorest communities most heavily. So we find ourselves in a world with a lot to be distressed about. 730 million people are not able to get enough to eat. Hunger levels that we haven't seen in decades. And we're still trying to recover from the pandemic, trying to recover from a generation of learning losses, education, and many, many other challenges. So, exactly at this moment in time when we need to be unleashing resources for crisis response and for sustainability and resilience building, we find ourselves actually, unfortunately, facing a growing gap in terms of the resources, the financing that is needed. And we take the United Nations, and when I say we, I mean you, it is the countries of the world. We take the 2030 Agenda, the Sustainable Development Goals, as our lodestar to get us through these choppy seas. To continue, we can't lose sight of this navigation device. And yet, we see that we are meandering terribly off track. Only 12% of these global goals are considered more or less on track. Nearly half are badly off track. A third of the global goals have seen either no progress at all or are actually backsliding in the last few years of this polycrisis as compared to the 2015 baseline. So, and this lack of progress is universal, but again, the impact is felt most decidedly on the poorest countries and the poorest communities within countries. So, this is a moment in time when we need to be investing in ourselves and in our future. And yet we see an annual financing gap estimated for the Sustainable Development Goals 2030 of something like $4 trillion a year, leading us to really more and more a two-track world, haves and the have-nots, as we're often wont to say. Now, a big part of this issue, of course, and the conversations here today, is around debt. Debt, as we know, can be a powerful tool. In fact, it's a necessary tool to provide development and boost productivity and living standards, whether you're a household, whether you're a corporation or a country, if used well and if accessed on a fair playing field. And yet we see in the world that there are terrible borrowing inequities. The developing countries of the world, least developed countries, are often borrowing at rates of 5 to 8%, or let's say 5 to 8 times greater than many developed countries are borrowing. And the rising interest rates within this context of polycrisis are just making that more and more critical for the ability to finance education, health, and social expenditures. So we see that 40% of people living in extreme poverty live in countries with severe debt problems. We call this, the Secretary General has said, these are countries on debt row, facing existential crises in terms of their fiscal resources. 3.3 billion people, that's nearly half of humanity, live in countries that spend more on their annual debt interest payments than on health and education. So this is a losing model by any calculation. Almost a third, more than a third of developing countries are facing severe debt crises. And there's a sort of wicked overlap with those other crises I was talking about, with climate change, for example. So more than half of the world's most climate vulnerable countries are those, in other words, those who have contributed the least to climate change are those paying the highest prices now and facing the greatest debt crises. As the Secretary General has said, these poor countries are being forced to choose, to make a terrible choice that nobody should ever have to choose between, and that is, do you service your debt, or do you put food on the table of your people? Do you send your children to school? Do you build adaptation capacities for this climate crisis that is impacting us each and every single day? We talk about temperature rise, and as I mentioned last night, we're the hottest, this is the hottest month on record. We've had the hottest day on record a few days ago. Can we imagine what will happen when these hottest days are actually cool by comparison in the very near future to what awaits? So if we're not building those resilient capacities. So, you know, we look at, okay, what as a world community do we have in place to address these challenges? And we do have an international financial architecture. The problem is, we look at that and it's broken. It was designed and built in the era of the Second World War, in the aftermath of the Second World War. It was designed and built by developed countries, more or less with developed countries in mind. And long before we understood the realities of challenges like climate change, long before we had the deeply integrated financial systems and architectures that we have today. So the Secretary General tells us, and it's no secret, of course, that the system is totally unfit for purpose at the moment. And there are several sort of dimensions that define that. First of all, the international financial institutions are severely underfunded to meet their mandates, and this is a gap that is becoming impossible to ignore. The World Bank's capital base, for example, meant to alleviate poverty in the most vulnerable countries and doing tremendous work, I should add. It's less than 1/5 of what it was relative to the world economy in 1960. Secondly, as I mentioned before, the system is deeply unfair. For example, the IMF's special drawing rights, SDRs, meant to provide important liquidity access for countries facing debt crises, they are not going to the countries that need them. So Africa, for example, home to 60% of the world's extreme poor, received only 5.4% of the latest issuance of SDRs. So there are ways to quickly rebalance the allocation of those SDRs. Now, the solutions are urgent, and therefore the Secretary General has put together, has developed, and has launched what he's calling an SDG stimulus plan. And I think this is where we've seen really, truly important partnership between India's G20 presidency in terms of leading the call for a focus on the needs of the developing world and the United Nations call for stimulus. And we're finding that language in the outcome documents of the G20 presidency. So for example, the stimulus talks about providing immediate, affordable, long-term financing for developing countries. It's calling for at least $500 billion a year, applied to three critical strategic thrusts, let's say. First is a massive surge in finance, requiring the multilateral development banks to transform their business models, to have a completely new approach to risk, to leverage their funds to attract trillions of dollars of private financing. Because as we all know, I mean, there are plenty of resources. There is plenty of money in the world. The question is, where is it going? You can look at, I mean, I'm a fan of sports and entertainment industry, but you can look at the trillions of dollars spent on entertainment each and every year. And you can recognize that really it's not about a lack of resources. So secondly, the SDG stimulus tackles the high cost of debt for new initiatives and enables countries in distress to exchange short-term debt, that sort of debt under which they are drowning on daily payments, for longer-term instruments to spread that debt burden across a longer time horizon. And then finally, contingency financing, the ability for countries in distress from climate change, from the impacts of war, to build in alleviation of debt payments in the cases where they need to have contingency measures put into place, and have it already there so that we don't spend, you see efforts of the G20, you see efforts of the financial system to come together in time of crisis, but it takes so much time. By the time, you know, talking, by the time there's some sort of a solution, the problem has gone even beyond that. So we are calling, the United Nations Secretary General is calling for a Bretton Woods 2.0. And this is not an incremental change. This is a transformation of the international financial system. And the blueprint, this comes under the Secretary General's Our Common Agenda policy brief and the 2023 Financing for Sustainable Development report. So I won't go into the details of all of that, but I do encourage all of you, if you're not familiar with these, to familiarize. But it's going across the whole gamut, addressing debt relief, tax reforms, loss and damage fund for climate change, MDB reform, and promoting issues such as universal social protection systems. The upcoming, I mentioned the G20 presidency. The upcoming summit provides an incredibly important and timely moment, as I said before, it handshakes directly with the General Assembly, the SDG summit that will come 8 days later after the Delhi summit here. And India's presidency, which I often call an SDG 20, because it's so aligned with the SDGs, actually has developed a triple agenda of the independent expert group looking at these, how to reform the international financial architecture. And the recommendations of this group align very, very well with the call of the United Nations, calling for an additional spending of $3 trillion per year across climate action and to achieve the SDGs. So I think that we look forward to the summit, to the Delhi summit, to the SDG action plan, acceleration action plan, the G20 that India will be bringing to the world, to New York, 8 days later, at the General Assembly at precisely the moment we need. We have, colleagues, to conclude, no time to waste, obviously. If we want to achieve 1.5 degrees, if we want to achieve the vision of a sustainable, prosperous, equitable world for ourselves and for our future generations, we must act now. And I do believe that it is this spirit, as we were talking about last night, Vasudeva Kutumbakam, the world coming together, and partnership between governments, between civil societies, between the peoples, represented by all of you here in this incredibly diverse room today. This is what we need to do. Men and women, girls and boys, coming together. It is possible. We can achieve. There is still time, but we cannot rest. And India's G20 presidency is providing exactly the stimulus to this discussion on behalf of the Global South, bringing the Global South, the voice of the Global South, exactly when we need it. So thank you very much. I wish everybody the most productive rest of the day, and I appreciate once again the organizers for putting together such a fascinating series of conversations and bringing together so many important voices from across the world. Thank you very much. Bahut dhanyavad.
Thank you, sir. It's now time for the next speaker, Mr. Harald Drager. He is the founding member and current president of the Worldwide Acting Society, TIEMS, which stands for the International Emergency Management Society, which he established in 1993. TIEMS is a well-recognized organization with growing activities in Asia, Europe, Africa, Australia, and North America, as well as Latin America and the Caribbean. Mr. Drager monitored its development to a globally well-known organization with local chapters in 16 regions and countries. TIEMS arranges each year workshops and conferences all over the world with focus on disaster risk reduction. Mr. Drager has extensive experience from industry and research activity, especially in emergency and risk management. Warm welcome to you, sir. Please come.
I don't see my slides. Okay, I can start to say thank you, Mr. Chairman, co-speakers, and C20 and G20 leaders and all delegates. It's a pleasure for me to be here today and address you on my organization. And I hope you find this of interest, and we look forward to cooperation. Yeah, first one, please.
Next.
Yeah, but I'd like to see them here. I don't see them?
Yes. Next and big.
Yeah, but I want them here. I want them on this screen.
Oh, this is in.
Okay, we...
Next
I
and
see,
back.
okay. Okay, when we have ordered this, okay. But first, I want to say that I'm very honored to be invited here and have the possibility to address you in this very prestigious organization. But last night, there was a very great experience, the opening, and to meet Amma. I didn't know about her before because of my ignorance, but I had the opportunity to meet her face to face when she left, and I saw a young, strong face and greeting me, and that was a great inspiration. I understand how inspiring she must be for all of you. And I will take that with me for the rest of my life and for my organization as a role model, how we can further develop together with it. I'm an engineer by education, and therefore I always need to leave a footprint by showing you my slide production. And what I will address you on is building sustainable and resilient communities and the perspective we have in my organization. I have left my cards, business cards outside. You can take one, you can ask, and you can get the presentation I can send you. And because I will just see if it works. There we go. Comment on the slides in order to keep my time. And as you see, the world is at risk, and we are facing more disasters with a higher frequency. And for those who follow the news, you see it's burning in Europe, in Greece, in Rhodes, and in Spain, and in Canada, all over the world. We are heating up, we have a heat wave, and we have floods. And also I read in the news that Taj Mahal was actually threatened by floods. And I will come back to the cultural heritage, which I think is very important. Some numbers, I can't read them for here because it hasn't given me this, but you see the numbers that last year, 387 natural hazards and disasters, resulting in more than 30,000 lives and affecting many millions, 185 millions. And the cost of this is economic losses of about more than 3,000 billion in 2022. So this is critical. And I like to say what Obama said. We are a generation of, I really can't read my slides from here. They are making it a little bit difficult for me. No one can sort that out. Okay, I have to turn then, okay? We are the first generation to feel the impact of climate change and the last generation that can do something about it. Remember that. And as you see, we are at the tipping point. I mentioned some of these: increasing frequency, magnitude, and huge economic impact. And this is also resulting in widening inequalities among population worldwide, worsening poverty and deprivation, and the COVID-19 learned us a lesson. We handled it, but it may come back. And the war in Ukraine is also quite a tragedy. And myself, I was born during the Second World War. And all the time since the Second World War, I'm from Norway, so we have had a growth even, and we didn't believe that this should happen. So, okay, some technical issues here, but we can handle it.
You have to just do it.
Oh, I do it here. Right. Okay, global scenario of disasters and climate change. We listed a lot of things which are happening. And I mentioned some of them to you, and you feel it every day. Heat waves, floods, wildfires, pandemics all over the world. Technology is not working very well this morning.
You're trying to go back?
Oh, sorry.
Next and back.
Okay, we got a new, okay, I take it. And there is a critical urgency for multi-stakeholder engagement. And you can read the slides, but I will point out what I have done in fat print. We have to create an enabling environment for marginalized and weaker sections through inclusive, gender-sensitive, participatory, and holistic approaches. And G20 member countries, who contribute 85% of the global GDP, 75% of global trade and houses, 2/3 of the world population. And among the G20 platforms, the civil society platform G20 has been showing the courage to speak the truth to the world leaders and the powerful G20 members. And this is important. And I understand this has gone on from this C20 summit, from Indonesia, here now to India, and further on to Brazil. And
I can probably help you with the slide. Moving the slide.
all right, okay, fine. And this provide an unique opportunity to provide the G20 leadership to a very defining period of intense deliberation. There we go, now we are back. You all know these. The global networks need to reach their targets within 2030. Are we close? Well, maybe there is still a lot to do. And the current situation indicates the need for a quantum leaps in transformational leadership, while innovative, disruptive solutions as the global framework, which are off track with only 7 years for 2030. Innovative disaster risk financing instruments are required, and multidisciplinary professionals need to be provided with training, capacity building, education, and certification by professional networks. And humbly enough, the International Emergency Management Society Teams is pleased to offer its network for capacity building in order to join you and work with you.
You see the different screen there.
Oh, sorry. There we are. Okay. He put up the wrong one. Sorry about technologies. Did you show the wrong one? Go back. This one.
You want to show that?
Okay. Yeah, there we go. You can go on. I've been through this, but I didn't show. Okay, here we are online. Sorry for that. Right. Okay, guys, we are back. And you know all these networks, and the target is by 2030. Are we close? Can we reach it? I have to operate two things here. Okay, I will tell you a little bit about my organization, and you can read our vision, you can read our mission, and how do we work. We work to achieve its mission through the exchange of information, innovation, and good practices in education, training, certification, and research and development. So when we talk about teams, we talk about education, communication, and technology. I hope we are doing this right now. No, it didn't move here. Okay, no, it works. Okay, as an emergency manager, I have to handle things like this. So when I'm finished, you can download and get the presentation and see what you missed. But anyway, our activities, we are around the world, and we think it's very important to focus on cultural differences to be understood and included in the society's events. Because we do things differently. We have to know it, we have to share it, and we have to learn from it. I listed the activities we are doing, and I will focus on a couple of them. But I saw the presentation by the Boston Global Forum concerning AI. And we are also looking into this because AI is very important because it's a powerful memory. And in emergency management, we have to know what did we do wrong in the past. How do we learn from lessons? And the first lesson is we never learn. So we have to, and AI can help us, it can drag out and it can compare and come up with the right conclusions. So let me go on, see if it works now, both working. And we are also then addressing the sustainable development goals through our activities. And I will list that. Here you see our board of directors from it's 12 of them from about 11 nations. And if you observe, and I also observed some other slides earlier, we have a gender issue. There are no women here. And that's not our fault, because we work in a technology field. Women are good on that, but they haven't approached us. We had one strong woman on board, Snezhana Knežis. She was very good. She was a professor in Split in Croatia. Unfortunately, she passed away last year. But in her memory, we have opened a scholarship. So at every conference we do, we give away her award to the best students. But I have met a lot of powerful women in this audience. And if this inspire you, why don't you approach me or Vinod Menon, who is my representative here in India? You can come on board and be part of us and do the gender equality. Coming from, you know, I'm born and raised in Norway by a very strong mother. And in Norway, there is a law. Half of the ministers in the government have to be women. So the country and myself, we have no gender problems. But the women have to come to us and say, I like to be part of this. And let me continue. And we have chapters around the world. One here is India. I will come back to that. But you can also see there are countries we don't have chapters. And please come to me and say, this is interesting. And we work voluntarily. So don't think you should be rewarded by money for it, but by doing a good job. And I hope some of you find it interesting. Especially, I knew you were in Indonesia last year. You go to Brazil. Neither of the countries we have any representatives. So we like to invite you on board. And one thing we do, we started back in 1994 in Fort Lauderdale in USA. And here you see the countries we have traveled. And as I say, Team's annual conference journey around the world has been an amazing tour through different cultures, different cuisines, and a learning and exchange of experience of different ways of doing emergency management. And we will be, and I will come back to that, India next year. So this opportunity is very time-wise for us to announce it, that you can be part of this here in India next year. We will be in... Time is running? Yeah, I'm almost finished, but due to technology, I give myself a couple of minutes. because I like to tell you about our research, because we have to look forward to see what can we improve. We have to test out solutions. And we have to learn from the past. So this is the research. These are the list of the research we have been doing together, mostly funded by the European Union. I will not go through all of them. When you look at the presentation, you can click on the different and you see what we did. But I will take some of them, which I think is very important. The first one is called Asset, where we looked into pandemic situation. And this was before the pandemic. We started in 2013, we finished in 2017, and this was about communication, because you see the background was the following. That was the H1N1 pandemic in 2009. The World Health Organization believed it could be a pandemic. It didn't show up. And people got skeptical and said, why this? Was it to help the pharmaceutical companies? There was a lot of mistrust. And our role in the Asset project on pandemic was, how do we restore the trust between the public and the authorities? And one of the conclusions was participatory governance. That means, how do we include the public when we make decisions? And that was a very important conclusion. The second one is about cultural heritage. And we did one project. We had certain sites, and we developed a platform for maintenance. And cultural heritage is important. And as I said earlier, Taj Mahal was threatened by flood. So you know it. And the next one was the state of civil protection, because the civil protection is there in order to react and protect you. But it's very differently financed worldwide. This public safety index we involved in this, but the report was never published from the World Bank. We like to take that up again because we think it's an important production. One thing, we have to talk the same language all over the world. Therefore, we have started and developed a certification process. Here you see the countries which we have candidates certified. And this is one of the important things we do. And it's my baby, actually. I like to see this flourish. And we have already 2 certified here in India. We are in South Africa. You are welcome to join us both in person or online. You have to go to the website, you find, and you can go on. And the main topic is crisis, emergencies, and disasters, a continuum of challenges and opportunities in the 21st century. I hope you log in online and be there. We will have a 1 week from 11th to 15th of September with more than 100 presentations. So it will be a quite good event. The next one will be here, and it will be in India, and the host will be the India chapter, and you're all welcome. Contact Professor Vinyan Menon. He's a Teams Regional Director for Asia, sitting on the front row here. So if you don't know him. And I then say thank you, a little bit over time due to technology. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, sir. Our final speaker couldn't make it in person, Dr. Anant Nageshwaran, who is the Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India. He has, however, kindly consented to send a video message, which we will be playing. A very brief introduction for him. Dr. Nageshwaran has worked as the Global Chief Investment Officer at Julius Baer Bank in Switzerland. He has also served as the Head of Research for Asia for the bank. He has worked for Credit Suisse in Switzerland and Singapore, and Union Bank of Switzerland as well. He has served as Dean of IFMR Graduate School of Business in Chennai and also as a professor at Singapore Management University. Dr. Nageshwaran is also an author, a consultant, and is in the board of directors of various companies. He holds a doctoral degree in economics from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. So we'll now play the video message from Dr. Nageshwaran.
Good morning, namaskar, namaste, and vanakkam to everybody. It is indeed a pleasure to be able to speak to the C20, Civil 20 India 2023 Summit. I would very much like to have been there, physically present, and partaking in the proceedings, learning from all of you. I unfortunately am not able to do that due to other commitments. Before I share my thoughts on the topic assigned to me, I must compliment Ambassador Mr. Vijay Nambiar and his fellow steering committee members for putting together such a wonderful program on a variety of topics related to the society, which also impinge on the economy considerably, not just with respect to India, not just with respect to G20, but also with respect to the entire global south and developing countries. So in that sense, it is indeed a pity, a personal loss for me, not to be able to join you all in Jaipur and being part of the proceedings. I'm sure the conference had a great first day, and the second day will be no different. And many of you present there would go back with not only pleasant memories, but also with invaluable insights. The theme of this particular session is financing sustainable development goals and ensuring resilience for people and planet. It is a very apt topic considering the circumstances that developing countries face, especially in the post-COVID era, especially in the post-commodity price shock era from 2022. Sustainable development goals and resilience for people and planet actually go together. But these days, we do not hear so much about resilience as much as we hear about mitigation, especially mitigation of emissions of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in general. But adaptation and resilience matter a great deal to countries in the global south. Mitigation, no doubt, is important because over time, as today's developing countries become more developed, they will emit more, and they do have to have plans in place to mitigate them. However, there are short, medium, and long-run priorities. And we don't get to the long run if we cannot survive and flourish in the short and the medium run. To be able to survive and flourish in the short and medium run, adaptation and resilience to climate shocks that are already set in motion by emissions of the past are important. And that is where sustainable development goals and their financing come into the picture. Developing countries have to prepare themselves with adaptation and resilience and get better at them, not only, as I mentioned earlier, to withstand the climate shocks and growth shocks which follow as a consequence, arising from emissions of the past, but also to generate the kind of resources that they would need to be able to invest and stay within the carbon emission budget that they will be allotted or they are being allotted if future temperature increases have to be kept within particular limits, no matter how arbitrarily chosen those limits are. And growth, therefore, is such an important precondition for managing climate change, to adapt, to build resilience, and to mitigate future emissions. Economic growth and managing climate change, or for that matter, energy transition, of which managing climate change is a part, are not orthogonal to each other. They are not in contradiction to each other. Developing countries do indeed need resources, public sector or private sector resources, to be able to save themselves from the shocks that have already been set in motion by past emissions, but also to make the investments necessary to transition to a net zero or low carbon economy. Recently, the independent expert group appointed by the Indian G20 presidency had come out with the first part of its report. And in terms of the additional funding of $3 trillion that is required according to their estimates by 2030, they do anticipate that $2 trillion have to come from domestic resources for the countries in the world, whether it is from private sector or public sector. And we all know that domestic savings get generated as a consequence of economic growth. And of course, savings do contribute to investment and in turn to economic growth. So they both are mutually interdependent. For countries to be able to grow, therefore, is very important, even if one is wedded to managing climate change, rein in global warming. The Indian presidency of the G20 had appointed an independent expert group, which is co-chaired by Mr. N.K. Singh and president of the Harvard University, Dr. Larry Summers. They came out with the first part of their report. They spoke about the need for resources to the tune of $3 trillion by 2030 for developing countries, for the global south, to be able to make the kind of investments they need to make their economies a low carbon or set their economies on the path to a net zero economy by 2050, or depending on the timeline they have chosen. Of those $3 trillion of resources that these countries need, they expect about $2 trillion to come from domestic sources, private or public sector. Domestic resources or savings do get generated when economic growth happens. And of course, savings in turn contribute to investment, which in turn contribute to economic growth. There is a sense of mutual interdependence between savings and economic growth. But we all know that growth is indeed a prerequisite for economic growth to happen. I beg your pardon. Economic growth is indeed a prerequisite for savings and additional public resources to be generated. And that is where the importance of sustainable development goals come into picture. While we all know that conventional macroeconomics tells us about the need for infrastructure, investment in plant and equipment and businesses, etc., we know that human resource endowment, adequate health, nutrition, clean air, environment, preservation of nature, biodiversity, all of them operate synergistically to be able to sustain economic growth, not only from the angles of environmental and ecological sustainability, but even in the sense of the English language, to sustain economic growth over longer periods. Investment in all these areas have to be taken into consideration. Preservation of all these elements matters for economies to continue to generate wealth and growth and prosperity for everybody. There are no trade-offs in the long run between SDGs and economic prosperity. In the very short run, they may be. More importantly, the Sustainable Development Goals, or SDGs, which actually got formulated in the same year in Paris, but well before the climate goals were formulated, and recently in the G20 third FMCBG, there was a side event on macroeconomic implications of climate change. And Mr. Vitor Gaspar, former Portuguese minister, who is now with the IMF Fiscal Affairs Department, participated in the side event on climate change and macroeconomic consequences. I was also a panelist, and he made it very clear. Sustainable development goals were not only announced and formulated before climate goals, but they also take precedence in terms of the relative importance. he was quite categorical about it, and I was very happy to see that kind of a statement come from the International Monetary Fund senior official. Especially post-COVID, when learning outcomes, nutrition outcomes, and other health outcomes had suffered because of the pandemic and because of the attention paid to treating and handling the pandemic to the exclusion of other health conditions and diseases, reiterating the importance of sustainable development goals is critical. And reiteration cannot happen in words, but also must happen in terms of generation and provision of adequate funding for that. So in all our anxiety to mitigate emissions and combat global warming and climate change, we should not miss or understate the importance of sustainable development goals and their preconditions for handling climate change. So how do we finance sustainable development goals? To the extent many of them cannot be financed by the private sector because they are not income generating activities, let's say, but they contribute to overall economic growth, funding does indeed have to come from public sector resources, domestic or international, and both. So therefore, ensuring that adequate concessional financing is made available to developing countries of the global south for meeting their sustainable development goals is very important. And global committee of nations and multilateral organizations must step up to the challenge and ensure that funding for sustainable development goals is made available in the right quantities to the right countries at the right time. There could be some elements of sustainable development goals which lend themselves to private sector financing. But even there, given the information gaps that exist between the private sector's return aspirations and the information availability from the borrowing countries, there needs to be de-risking mechanisms to be able to make it attractive for the private sector to finance such sustainable development goals, which the private sector can finance because they are return generating opportunities. At the same time, there is no return without risk taking. So if all downside is under return or socialized and all upside is privatized, it is not a fair deal, both for the insurers, risk insurers, or for the borrowing countries. So to that extent, there has to be a right balance between risk taking and risk underwriting. Private sector also, in general, invest when there are adequate projects available in developing countries. So even sustainable development goal projects, whether it is provision of water, sewage treatment, right environment, biodiversity, etc., there has to be projects that they can invest in and building up capacity in developing countries to generate a shelf of projects that can be funded by the private sector is essential. And that is where multilateral development institutions, even bilateral sovereigns, can play a role in building that capacity in global south countries, in developing projects that can be financed by the private sector with appropriate levels of risk mitigation, both for the borrowing countries and for the investors. So in the post-COVID era, while there is much discussion about mitigating global warming, mitigating carbon and greenhouse gas emissions, combating climate change, and therefore global public goods in general are given huge airspace, we should not forget the primacy of sustainable development goals. And countries which earlier used to be middle-income countries are now teetering on the edge of slipping into low-income country categories. That needs to be prevented. Therefore, financing sustainable development goals is very critical. Multilateral development institutions must show their commitment to financing SDGs. Their shareholders must also realize that meeting global public challenges and financing SDGs are not opposed to each other. Only when countries are confident and have met their SDG goals and are in a position to grow sustainably, will they be able to own the global public challenges and create global public goods? Therefore, this needs to be seen as a very important precondition and a very important funding requirement well ahead of creating financing options for global public challenges. In that spirit, I commend the Civil 20 Summit and Ambassador Vijay Nambiar for organizing this theme and ensuring that financing SDGs and ensuring resilience for people and planet are given the adequate level of importance and attention by all members of the G20 and beyond. I wish the two-day summit all success and once again thank them for inviting me to share my thoughts. And I apologize to them and to all of you for not being present there in person. Thank you very much.
Even without being physically with us, the message of Mr. Ananta Nageshwaran has been very interesting. And I thank him, and I have to thank everybody, every of our speakers, and Ritesh also to cooperate with me in co-hosting together this meeting. Just for final words, recalling that we touch a lot of issues this morning. Please go and read and deepen on the policy pack because the messages coming from the group are very detailed and the recommendation are very even concrete and relevant for our job. The 4 words or messages are this. First, peace. We spoke this morning about peace and about peace building. And peace needs regulations and resources. We have spoken about finance because resources are relevant to build sustainable communities and to preserve and to protect peace. And regulation is fundamental. Second, the main player of peace are communities and citizens, are not the states or other institutions, are the communities and we as citizens. And communities and citizens, thank you, has to be also let to play their role, so the democratic participation is fundamental at any level. Peace is based on democracy, is based on participation, democratic participation. Third, United Nations. Again, I repeat and raise this message. We need United Nations to help us together to put in place that needed regulation, that needed administration of resources, even of financial resources. We need UN-based mechanisms to deal with that. It's not just an issue of the fund and of the bank. It's an issue of all of us. That means United Nations. We need United Nations for taxation. We need United Nations for regulation of climate protection, etc. And let me say that. What happened in Rome, I come from Rome, I come from Italy, 1 week ago, it was not a good example. Because when we are speaking about a resilient community, we are speaking about the planet, we are speaking about food. At first, we are speaking about agriculture. And so we need sustainable food systems. In Rome, we met as United Nations for the United Nations Food System Summit. The process that led us to meet in Rome was not the proper process. We had the private sector involved. We didn't have communities involved. Indigenous communities, small-scale farmers networks from all over the world decided not to participate formally because the process to create the summit 2 years ago and this year was not really involving at the same level all the main actors. And I call that, I raise this call because I think that is relevant also to protect United Nations. And I'm very happy to have you in this moment to raise that call. The final point is that if all these things together mean peace, well, we are here as peace builder. And I think that the final synthesis of this morning is, or this session, but of all this summit together, is that we do want to be bridges builders. We do want to be peace builders. This morning with these speakers, it has been an opportunity to make a step forward in that direction. So thank you to having been with us. Thank you, Ritesh, to host with me this meeting. And a special gift to our speakers to thank them in a concrete way.
We have a 20-minute coffee tea break right outside here, and then we reconvene at 12 sharp for the third session, just before lunch. Please be back at